Hey folks, welcome to episode 2 of AoS 101. Today we're going to be talking about building your army to score. And by that I mean taking units in your army with the idea that you want to score points. So, AoS isn't a game about tabling your opponent. I've won games of AoS where I've had like sub 50 points of models on the table. I won a game at the Scottish Masters last year, or this year, where I think I had 7 zombies left, and that was all. I literally didn't have any other models. But I won that game by like 10 points. And generally, points are more important than anything else. However, I think it's fair to say that you can evaluate basically every single thing in terms of the points that it gives you, which does include attrition. So killing models actually can earn you points. You just need to sort of take a more long view. For example, if you killing your opponent's stuff until they only have 3 units left denies them a battle tactic where they need to have a unit in every quarter of the table, your attrition has kind of garnered points, just not maybe in such a direct fashion that was immediately obvious at the time. The point being, though, that, no pun intended, the only thing that matters in the game is points, really. And you can and should keep that in mind while you're building your list. So, if we're building for points, on the right, here's the order of battle tactics. Obviously, every Grand Alliance has their own battle tactics, and it's something that you should definitely kind of keep in mind. Honestly, what I do is I have this and a few other things just kind of like pasted into the spreadsheet that I use while I'm building my armies. And I think it's just kind of good until you know all of them kind of by heart or whatever, to have it there while you're building armies, because I think generally this is the kind of most important thing. So you ideally, one of the things that I write here is you never want to miss a battle tactic. I think that is pretty much always true. If you have the opportunity to pick a battle tactic, you don't want to miss it. And some of them definitely suit different types of armies. For example, if you're playing something that's a lot more kind of nimbly-bimbly and slippery, then maybe you're looking more at things like take their land or take the flanks. Whereas if you're like a go get them, kill them, fight them army, then maybe things like slay the tyrants, seize the center, do not waver are your kind of mainstay tactics. Or you can build armies that try to play for all of them. And the armies that I've been playing in Lumineth, I generally will look to hit as many of these as possible. A particular Lumineth example, I would say, is taking, say, Riverblades in your army. I would never build an army without Riverblades because they enable Reclaim the Realms, Take Their Land very, very well as being quite good for things like attack on 2 fronts and take the flanks. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're putting units in your list. So there's 8 tactics available to every faction. I think that you should be able to realistically score 7. And probably realistically quite reliably score 7. So if we go back to the list, the only one that I would say in my kind of normal armies that I struggle with is Slay the Tyrants. Slay the Tyrants is very dependent on what your opponent brings. If your opponent's only heroes are like Catacross or something, or like Nagash, then if you kill this model, you're probably winning the game. And also, those are probably quite risky models to pick with this, because whilst you might kill them over the course of a game, you can't guarantee the turn in which you will kill them. It's not unreasonable to kind of go all in on those models and leave them alive on some amount of health and then you fail your tactic. Maybe you could have more realistically done something like take their land on that turn and done the damage to them, and then you end up rolling well or your opponent rolls poorly and that model dies anyway. But if you had, it would have been wrong to pick Slay the Tyrants in that turn because it was maybe only like a 60% chance or something that you would achieve the tactic. So, something to kind of bear in mind. I would aim for 7 or so tactics. I think some Grand Alliances, this is easier than others. And some factions, this is easier than others. But certainly, I think all of these are quite achievable, and you should put enough kind of units in your army to try and be able to kind of contest these tactics, or well, achieve these tactics over the course of a game. I don't think that this is unrealistic or difficult for pretty much any build in the game. So, another kind of thing, I guess, to talk about here is by poor attrition units. It's maybe a little bit unfair, but that is like fast, skirmishy, nimbly, bimbly things. It's things that move around quickly. They can go to take the flanks. They can go to take their land. They can go to attack on two fronts for you and things like that by like walking into an empty zone. At this point, I honestly should like have bolded and underlined. Armies where like their only turn one tactic on certain deployments is like seize the center, but don't ever do that. Like don't do that. At least have options for something else, because there are armies out there like Tzeentch, like LRL, which are excellent at denying tactics to your opponent. Yeah, I would never ever want to only be able to score one tactic in a turn. That's just not it. So, building for objectives. This is the other side of the scoring coin. Objectives being this, the kind of circles that you stand in and score points, right? So traditionally, these were scored with large model counts. I have found generally that this is less true in 4th, just because the game is very, very lethal, and generally with how small objectives are, you don't fit as many models on it, and you kind of just kill everything. Like if you're taking an objective, it's quite common to just kill everything on it. There are some armies out there, like Gloomspite Gits and things like that can really stress high model counts, run like upwards of 150 models, and at that point it does start to be a thing again. But by and large, I think that we're kind of moving away from that trend. The other kind of objective scorers would be insanely mobile things, anything Hurricane, True Revenants. I feel like there's Shadow Stalkers. There's a ton of units that fall under that kind of category. Stuff that can just kind of nip around the board and take objectives. Very, very good. Shooting is... So usually if you think of taking objectives off of people, you think of like melee, right? Which is charges and, kind of charging into an objective and killing everything on it, and now it's your objective. You can do it with shooting, but it is usually more difficult. So most armies you can screen off of an objective. You can, especially with how small objectives are now, you can make it so that they literally cannot put a model on an objective without charging you. However, an alternative to that, for example, if you're playing something like Caradron Overlords, is maiming a unit to the point where it's useless, and then charging the kind of dregs of that unit with something speedy and reasonably resilient to then take the objective off of them. That can work. I think it's usually better with with rules like Gossamer Archers or Hurricane, where they can reliably move after the shooting phase. But that is kind of quite achievable. Shooting can definitely help you take objectives as well. It's just if you don't have reliable movement, it's maybe a little bit riskier, because you are relying on something on an objective surviving for you to be able to charge. But yeah, so another thing here to talk about, this was like the old empire of Soulblight, is board control and area denial. So some armies, I think at the moment, the worst thing I've seen is probably like Plague Monk spam, but also I'm sure Gits can achieve something similar. Anything with like a ridiculous body count and a massive footprint, you can sometimes just take up enough of the board that your opponent can't even get close to objectives for like turns at a time, and they end up scoring like 2 on primary for the first 2 rounds or something, and that can be really, really strong too. I think Nurgle Flies can do something like that. The Nagash Death Raider army and certain battle plans can do things like that, where you can, if the game is taking place in the middle of the table and your opponent has no way to kind of sneak over a wall of 30 horses with a 5-up ward save, then you can kind of pin them into their deployment and go up really high on points. However, that does come at a cost of attrition, which is something that I want to talk about now. The value of attrition when it comes to scoring. So the most obvious bit here is that like it's impossible to score points if you don't have an army, right? Like you can't pick tactics, you can't take zones. So by and large, winning the game on attrition is the most powerful thing in terms of scoring the primary. That's not always true. There are armies out there, like, to go back to 3rd, Old Soulblight were great at losing attrition, but losing it slowly enough that they would have a massive monster lead on primary against some armies. I would say that that's not the case for really any army in 4th. Also, I feel like if you table your opponent, usually in this edition it happens in like turn 3, and then you kind of get 2 turns to catch up in scoring. So I would say at the moment attrition is very powerful. Being able to kill your opponent's army is really, really strong. And there's a lot of things that you can do with attrition. If you are, and by attrition, just to be clear, I mean fighting like your opponent. Both of you trading units, and ideally if you're winning attrition, you are trading less than they are trading. And there can be some kind of pros and cons to this. Like, for example, you can trade a 600 point unit to kill, I don't know, 300 points of your opponent's army, but if the 300 points that you've killed are the only thing in the table that was threatening, say, like, I don't know, your Katakros or your Nagash or something like that, now you're winning attrition even if you're down on points, because that model or that unit or whatever that is now not threatened can just rampage across the entire table. And things like that can be quite important to identify, and they can turn into really large point leads. So by buying you the entire table here, I mean in terms of space. If your opponent has to respect your attrition to the point where, like, if they don't, they will lose the game, they will not have any models left, you can buy space and make it so that they cannot enter objectives. Good examples of this can be things like, for example, covering fire. If your opponent's trying to do something like take the flanks, take their land, seize the center, and you have a really strong covering fire unit, you can make your opponent think twice about kind of going for it, where they will be like, okay, well, you'll kill my unit. Okay, so that's not really attrition. However, what they'll usually do in response to that is put a unit out in front so that they can still score their tactic and absorb the covering fire. However, if you've been winning attrition until that point, maybe they don't have a spare unit left and they have to kind of roll the dice and gamble. Other examples of that would be kind of like what I mentioned earlier, where your opponent can maybe not be left with enough units to even achieve the battle tactic. So, by and large, I would say that attrition scores and denies battle tactics. It's just in a less visible way than things like mobility. So, if you're playing something that just kind of reliably tables your opponent by turn 2, you'll win every single game, because they won't have any stuff left. Even if you don't score any points for the first 2 turns. You know, if you literally table your opponent, it doesn't matter. And I think that that's quite important to keep in mind in 4th, with how kind of powerful attrition is relative to scoring, compared to, say, 3rd edition, where it was all about scoring. So, tactics versus attrition. Now, one of the things that I really want to talk about here is seize the center. Seize the center, when I first started the game, I was like, oh, this is the tactic that you get as like a reward for going first, right? This is like, because going first is a disadvantage in most situations. Having turn control is really, really valuable. So you get seize the center for free if you go first, is kind of what I thought. It was like, right, okay, cool. So if you go first, you get seize the center. That sort of balances that out. However, seize the center is oftentimes a massive trap, because you usually are just putting 2 units in the kind of in range to die, which is not good. You don't want to do that. Having 2 units just kind of get taken off the board by your opponent's turn 1 alpha strike, and then them having the option to double you, not good. I think seize the center is actually much better as like a mid to late game tactic. It's rare that seize the center can be done early. It can be against slower armies, or if it's an army that is so fast that you're in threat range anyway, and maybe it's like a gun line or something like that, you can do seize the center because it doesn't really matter where you stand. But something to be careful of is trading too much on the kind of attrition needle for what looks like a battle, a good battle tactic. Maybe it's better to take a slightly worse battle tactic, or like a battle tactic you'd rather say for later, but it means that you're not giving away as much on attrition. And frankly, that's the game, is deciding how much you can actually give away in terms of attrition to achieve your battle tactics. So, by and large, the way that I would look at it is armies like some, say, OBR, Nurgle, Khorne traditionally, things like that, maybe looking to go a little bit down in terms of the tactic primary game early. That's maybe primary is maybe not right, but in terms of kind of, I don't know, agency to impact the game, because they're like slow, ponderous, bricky type things, and then later they will make it back up by your opponent just not having the stuff left to stop you from kind of moving your giant death ball around the table, as opposed to something like, I don't know, Lumineth or whatever, or Sylvaneth, where they'll spread out and take up much more of the table, and then later on, when like their stuff's dead, they don't have such an easy time controlling the entire table and like putting models in every objective that they want and things like that. I think that you can oftentimes, I don't know how to put this, you can oftentimes fall into a trap where you feel like you need to score your tactic, but you're actually just shooting yourself in the foot so much attrition-wise that maybe you just either should do something else that isn't so difficult, or, and I see people do that quite a lot, or you just cede the tactic and just be like, okay, you know what, I just don't want to. I had one of my games in Release the Beast where I picked a tactic that I think I had maybe like a 10% or two to go for, but that was because all of the other tactics would have put me in such a terrible spot attrition-wise. I was like, I'm just going to go down 4 points. And then I ended up winning that game by a lot. So I think that can be kind of a valuable lesson, where sometimes it's right to just say, no, I don't want to take this attrition hit. Also, the underdog is something that I actually haven't mentioned in the notes here, but being the underdog is really valuable, especially for a lot of armies that kind of reliably use commands in several phases, armies that want to intervene constantly, armies that really benefit from holding up countercharge, etc. And I think that the double is something to bear in mind as well. One of the interesting things about the double is you can make the points back up on the double quite reliably in terms of the kind of attrition damage that you'll do to your opponent, where it makes it much harder for them to score tactics in primary, and they need to... Oftentimes your opponent will be incentivized to double you back, but doubling first is usually better because you'll get to deliver a bigger hit. But if you score, say your double effectively scores you like 4 points of difference or whatever, by killing enough stuff in your opponent's army that you're going to cost them a tactic later in the game, hypothetically, right? You actually haven't selected a battle tactic to do that, which means that then your choice of battle tactics is still sort of like, you can pick the 4 best battle tactics for you that game, as opposed to your opponent who, if they never get the double, maybe they have to pick 5 battle tactics, and one of them is actually significantly it's just harder to achieve. If you're looking at, like, if you're playing Tzeentch and you've doubled your opponent, then you get to do something like, I don't know, take their land twice, take the flanks, and slay the entourage on like your opponent's 2 model left unit or something like that. You've had a really easy time of tactics, whereas maybe your opponent is out there absolutely struggling, having to have done 5. So it's an interesting thing to think about, that dynamic. I think the double is an excellent example of attrition versus kind of battle tactics. I think at the moment, though, the double is overpowered. Personally, I think the double is totally overpowered. Armies are just too killy, kind of in general. I actually don't think that's fair to say that armies are too lethal. I think they've massively nerfed the survivability of most stuff in the game. The removal of Mystic Shield and Finest Hour has done a lot. So most armies are quite fragile, and if you double them, they will lose huge gouts of things in a way that just kind of didn't happen previously. Also, countercharge makes the game quite a bit more lethal. Anyway, I think that, with that being said, you probably don't ever want to be dropping tactics. It's just okay to lose them, and to lose one to the double if you have achieved enough work. And it's almost never right to lose one because you failed to achieve it. Generally, your army should be built in a way that it can score the battle tactics pretty reliably. I think when you're building a list, you probably are being like, okay, do I want to be like a nimbly bimbly purely scoring all of my tactics reliably army? Do I want to be an army that's like a big brick, and maybe it struggles a little bit with tactics, especially the more movement ones? Like, think about things like, I don't know, traditional OBR or something like that, where take the flanks, maybe a bit difficult, take their land, maybe a bit difficult, especially in the early game before you've kind of spread out and gotten across the board very much, but you're going to batter your opponent on attrition. I think even with that said, one of the things I mentioned earlier, have a plan for turn 1 tactics that isn't just one tactic. One tactic turn 1 is not it. You're going to lose games off of that. By and large, controlling your objectives is an attrition thing. There are some armies that achieve it through not attrition, but generally if you're winning the game, you'll have, like, as in you're winning the battle, you'll have control over the objectives. By and large, I think objective control is more important than tactics. So, I mean, in theory, right, there's 30 points available for primary, and there's 20 points available for tactics, so, like, yeah, duh, but I do think that primary is also more difficult to score, but it's a solid thing to build into, to kind of reliably, I guess, get those points. However, if you can choose when to commit units, for example, if you were like, I can throw away this 10-man unit to get 2 points in primary on turn 1, or you could make the same choice on turn 5, then something to bear in mind is that in 4th, you're actually rewarded for making that choice on turn 5, because if you're 2 points down for the entire game, you get the underdog. So definitely something to keep in mind. Yeah, hopefully this has been helpful for people. I think this is a huge topic. This will be kind of one of the longer videos, I suppose. So I apologize for waffling on quite so much. I think maybe I'll come back to talk about this in future. But hopefully this has been helpful in terms of kind of contextualizing what you're actually achieving by killing your opponent's models. And hopefully it'll make people think that, if you're taking a turn where your plan is mostly just to kill models, why am I actually doing that? What am I actually getting out of this? Maybe before you pick which unit to kill, have a look at your opponent's battle tactics and think, oh, if I kill this one, it's maybe a little bit worse for me attrition-wise, but they'll really struggle to score this tactic. Or you can think, killing this unit puts me way up on attrition because then they can't compete with me for the rest of the game and I'll be able to score my battle tactics easier. So hopefully that gives everybody something to think about. The kind of approach that maybe attrition is actually just kind of a function of scoring points, and evaluating attrition as a function of scoring points kind of moving forwards. I think it's a mindset that can be really, really important for leveling up your Age of Sigmar play. So that's all for today. Hopefully that's been useful. Thank you very much for watching.